Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PG second semester for the course CC5 and Unit 3 or 4, you will determine. So, good morning. I am going to start my lecture on Siddhartha, a novel written by Hermann Hess. So Siddhartha is a novel which is prescribed for you along with A Passage to India and other novels. Siddhartha is a novel by Hermann Hess that deals with the spiritual journey of self-discovery of a man named Siddhartha during the time of the Gautam Buddha. The book, Hess's ninth novel, was written in German in a simple lyrical style. It was published in the US in 1951 and became influential during the 1960s. Hess dedicated the first part of it to Roma Roland and the second part to Wilhelm Gunther, his cousin. The word Siddhartha is made up of two words. In Sanskrit language, Siddha, achieved, or plus Artha, what was searched for, which together means he who has found meaning of existence or he who has attained his goals. In fact, the Buddha's own name before his renunciation was Siddhartha Gautam, Prince of Kapilavastu. In this book, the Buddha is referred to as Gautam or Gautam. The story takes place in the ancient Indian kingdom of Kapilavastu, which is now in Nepal. Siddhartha decides to leave behind his home in the hope of gaining spiritual illumination by becoming an ascetic wandering beggar of the shaman or shraman. This is meant for the sannyasis or a persons who have renounced this word, shaman, S-A-M-A-N-A-S, samanas. Joined by his best friend Govind, Siddhartha fasts, becomes homeless, renounces all personal possessions, and intensely meditates, eventually seeking and personally speaking with Gautam, the famous Buddha or the enlightened one. Afterward, both Siddhartha and Govinda acknowledge the elegance of the Buddha's teachings, although Govinda hastily joins the Buddha's order. Siddhartha does not follow, claiming that the Buddha's philosophy, though supremely wise, does not account for the necessarily distinct experiences of each person. He argues that the individual seeks an absolutely unique personal meaning that cannot be presented to him by a teacher. He thus resolves to carry on this quest alone. Siddhartha crosses a river, and the generous ferryman, whom Siddhartha is unable to pay, merely predicts that Siddhartha will return to the river later to compensate him in some way. Venturing onward towards city life, Siddhartha discovers Kamla, the most beautiful woman he has yet seen. Kamla, a courtesan, notes Siddhartha's handsome appearance and fast wit, telling him that he must become wealthy to win her affections so that she may teach him the art of love. Although Siddhartha despised materialistic pursuits as a Shraman, he agrees now to Kamla's suggestions. He directs him to the employ of Kamaswamy, a local businessman, and insists that he have Kamaswamy treat him as an equal rather than an underling. Siddhartha easily succeeds, providing a voice of patience and tranquility, which Siddhartha learned from his days as an ascetic against Kamaswamy's fits of passion. Thus Siddhartha becomes a rich man and Kamala's lover, though in his middle years he realizes that the luxurious lifestyle he has chosen is merely a game that lacks spiritual fulfillment. Leaving the fast-paced bustle of the city, Siddhartha returns to the river, fed up with life and disillusioned, contemplating suicide before falling into a meditative sleep, and is saved only by an eternal experience of holy word, Om. Holy word, Om. The very next morning, Siddhartha briefly reconnects with Govinda, who is passing through the area as a wandering Buddhist. Siddhartha decides to live the rest of his life in the presence of the spirituality inspirational river. Siddhartha thus reunites with the ferryman named Vasudeva, with whom he begins to humbler way of life. Although Vasudeva is a simple man, he understands and relates that the river has many voices and significant messages to divulge to any who might listen. Some years later, Kamala, now a Buddhist convert, is traveling to see the Buddha at his deathbed, accompanied by her reluctant young son, when she is beaten by a venomous snake near Siddhartha's river. Siddhartha recognizes her and analyzes that the boy is his own child. After Kamala's death, Siddhartha attempts to console and raise the furiously resistant boy until one day the child flees together. Although Siddhartha is desperate to find his runaway son, Vasudeva urges him to let the boy find his own path, much like Siddhartha did himself in his youth. Listening to the river with Vasudeva, Siddhartha realizes that time is an illusion and that all of his feelings and experiences, even those of suffering, are part of a great and ultimately jubilant fellowship of all things connected in the cyclical unity of nature. After Siddhartha's moment of illumination, Vasudeva claims that his work is done and he must depart into the woods, leaving Siddhartha peacefully fulfilled and alone once more. Toward the end of his life, Govinda hears about an enlightened ferryman and travels to Siddhartha, not initially recognizing him as his old childhood friend. Govinda asks the now elderly Siddhartha to relate his wisdom, and Siddhartha replies that for every true statement there is an opposite one that is also true. That language and the confines of time lead people to adhere to one fixed belief that does not account for the fullness of the truth. Because nature works in a self-sustaining cycle, Every entity carries in it the potential for its opposite, and so the world must always be considered complete. Siddhartha simply urges people. Siddhartha simply urges people to identify and love the world in its completeness. Siddhartha then requests that Govinda kiss his forehead, and when he does, Govinda experiences the visions of the timelessness that Siddhartha himself saw the Vasudeva by the river. Govinda bows to his wise friend, and Siddhartha smiles radiantly, having found enlightenment. So, I will let you acquainted with characters in the novel Siddhartha. Siddhartha is the protagonist. Govinda is a close friend of Siddhartha and follower of Gautam. Siddhartha's father, a Brahmin who was unable to satisfy Siddhartha's quest for enlightenment. The Shamanas, traveling ascetics who tell Siddhartha that deprivation leads to enlightenment. Gautama, the Buddha whose teachings are rejected, but those power of self-experience and self-wisdom is completely praised by Siddhartha. Kamala, a courtesan, and Siddhartha's sensual mentor, mother of his child, young Siddhartha. Kamaswami, a merchant who instructs Siddhartha on business. Young Siddhartha, son of Siddhartha and Kamala, lives with Siddhartha for a time, yet runs away to Eden. What is the theme of the novel? In Hess's novel, experience the totality of consciousness events of a human life is shown as the best way to approach understanding of reality and attain enlightenment. Hess's crafting of Siddhartha's journey shows that understanding is attained not through intellectual methods, not through immersing oneself in the carnal pleasures of the world and the accompanying pain of samsara. Rather, it is the completeness of these experiences that allows Siddhartha to attain understanding. Thus, individual events are meaningless when considered by themselves. Siddhartha's stay with the Shramanas and his immersion in the worlds of love and business do not ipso facto lead to nirvana, yet they cannot be considered distractions, for every action and event gives Siddhartha experience, which in turn leads to understanding. A major preoccupation of Hess in writing Siddhartha was to cure his sickness with life. That is, in German, that is called Lebenskrankheit, by immersing himself in Indian philosophy such as that expounded in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. The reason the second half of the book took so long to write was that Hess had not experienced that transcendental state of unity to which Siddhartha aspires. In an attempt to do so, Hess lived as a virtual semi-recluse and became totally immersed in the sacred teachings of both Hindu and Buddhist scriptures. Intention was to attain to that completeness which in the novel is the Buddha's badge of distinction. The novel is structured on three of the traditional stages of life for Hindu male students: brahmachari, householder, grihasth, and recluse, renunciate, vanprasth, as well as Buddha's Four Noble Truths, Part 1, and Eightfold Path, Part 2, which form 12 chapters, the number in the novel. Ralph Friedman mentions how Hess commented in a letter, Siddhartha does not, in the end, learn true wisdom from any teacher, but from a river that roars in a funny way, and from a kindly old fool who always smiles and is secretly a saint. In a lecture about Siddhartha, Hess claimed Buddha's Buddha's way to salvation has been criticized and doubted because it is thought to be wholly grounded in cognition. True, but it's not just intellectual cognition, not just learning and knowing, but spiritual experience that can earned only through strict discipline in a selfless life. Friedman also points out how Siddhartha described Hess's interior dialectic. All of the contrasting poles of his life were sharply etched. The restless departures and the search for stillness at home, the diversity of experience and the harmony of a unifying spirit, the security of religious dogma and the anxiety of freedom. Everhard Osterman has shown how Hess, while mixing the religious genre of the legend with that of the modern novel, seeks to reconcile with the double-edged effects of modernization, such as individualization, pluralism, or self-disciplining. The film version of Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha, you know that Siddhartha, the novel Siddhartha, was made into a film, made into a cinema by Conrad Rooks in 1972, and it was very popular. The movie was so popular that all the youths of the 70s, early 70s, were all in liking for the author as well as the film director, filmmaker Conrad Rooks. In 1971, a surrealistic adaptation as a musical western was placed as Zachary's. John Rubinstein starred in the title role, and George England was the director. Don Johnson played Matthew, the equivalent of Govinda. In recent years, several American publishers have commissioned new translations of the novel, which had previously been impossible because of copyright restrictions. In addition to these newer translations, Hilda Rosner's original 1951 translation is still being sold in a number of reprint editions, editions put out by various publishers. Hermann Hesse's short novel Siddhartha has sometimes been called a work of reverse missionary activity, bringing to the West the lessons of a typically Eastern story of spiritual searching and fulfillment. However, this deceptively simple and episodic tale of the title characters' progress through a life provides no conventional resolutions to the questions it poses. In emphasizing Siddhartha's self-assertive individuality to the questions it poses, individuality, Hess makes plain that his book is as much a product of Western as well as Eastern intellectual traditions. The story of the Brahmin's son who leaves home to seek deep and lasting satisfaction appears to end where it began, besides a river with Siddhartha and Govinda united in friendship. But the first words of the novel are a hint that it will proceed and find its momentum through a series of opposites in the shade of the house, in the sunshine near the boats on the river bank. Immediately, light is contrasted with shade, and the stability of home is contrasted with the vehicles that ply the river's flow, foreshadowing Siddhartha's future life with ferryman Vasudev. Each of the novel's 12 chapters, divided into two parts, finds Siddhartha simultaneously facing a crisis and a new beginning in his speech. One of the important questions to consider is whether Siddhartha's search is driven more by discontent with his current state or by a vision of where he is going. In succession, he rejects the intellectual and ritualistic teachings of his father and the other Brahmins, the self-abnegating rigors of the ascetic shamanas, the opportunity to become a disciple of Gautam, the Buddha, the world-weary existence of material success, and even the futile role of a protective father to his son. As Siddhartha reflects early on, the stages of his life are like the old skin that leaves the serpent. The image of rejuvenated snake sharpens the contrast between his deliberate intentions and the natural course of things. Through the stages of life, if we believe that Siddhartha achieves progress and not merely a change of circumstances in his lifelong search, it can be asked what part his own will plays in achieving the enlightenment that he finally comes to by the end of the story. To an observer, the scene of Govinda gazing raptly at the face of his old friend beside the river might appear to be simply their reunion after many years of separation. However, we are told that what Govinda sees reminds him of the smile of Gautam, the universally acknowledged sublime one, the Buddha whose lifelong disciple Govinda had been. In finally identifying Siddhartha with the Buddha, Hess suggests that the story he is telling is both more and less than an original work of fiction. It is important to keep in mind that Siddhartha is the given name of the person who came to be known as the Buddha. The early events in his life of the novel's protagonist closely parallel the traditional story of the Buddha's life. In the third chapter of the book, the fictional character Siddhartha meets Gautam, a portrayal of the historical Buddha, and during their dialogue rejects the idea of following him as a disciple among all other disciples, including his friend Govinda, in having Siddhartha set off on his own. Hess raises searching questions about the nature of the relationship between a teacher and a disciple, about how a teaching that reflects the experience of a teacher can still that experience in a follower. This is one of the series of encounters with individuals who profess to have something to teach Siddhartha and whose teachings he comes to find inadequate in various ways. The scholarship of the Brahmins that leads to intellectual progress but not happiness. The asceticism of the Shamanas that creates a stoic perseverance but nothing more. The art of love from Kamala that never results in a loving spirit, and the mercantile expertise of the merchant Kamaswami that leads only to unsatisfying entanglement in possessions. Through a movement from extreme to extreme, Siddhartha finally comes to the silent, listening Vasudeva, the ferryman. Vasudeva's expert ability to navigate the opposite banks of the river and all they represent becomes an emblem of the unity of spirit that Siddhartha has sought, and the almost wordless communion between the two leads to the culmination of Siddhartha's search. As Hess, Hermann Hess, has told the story, the apparent resolution of opposites that occurs at the end seems to embody a teaching, though perhaps not one that can be easily verbalized apart from the telling of the incidents of the story itself. At the same time, and in the spirit of Siddhartha's own search, Hess has raised questions for us about whether words can communicate the deepest truths or can only prepare us to experience them. In the 1960s, especially in the United States, the novels of Hermann Hesse were widely embraced by young readers who found in the protagonists a reflection of their own search for meaning in a troubled world. Hesse's rich allusions to world mythologies, especially those of Asia, and his persistent theme of the individual striving for integrity in opposition to received opinions and mass culture appealed to a generation in upheaval and in search of renewed values. Born in southern Germany in 1877, Hess came from a family of missionaries, scholars, and writers with strong ties to India. This early exposure to the philosophies and religions of Asia, filtered and interpreted by thinkers thoroughly steeped in the intellectual traditions and currents of modern Europe, provided Hess with some of the most pervasive elements in his short stories and novels, especially Siddhartha, published in 1922, and Journey to the East, published in 1932. Hess concentrated on writing poetry as a young man, but his first successful book was a novel, Peter Kamenzind, published in 1904. The income it brought permitted him to settle with his wife in rural Switzerland and write full time. By the start of World War I in 1914, Hess had produced several more novels and had begun to write the considerable number of book reviews and articles that, that made him a strong influence on the literary culture of his time. During the war, during the war, Hess was actively involved in relief efforts, depression, criticism for his pacifist views, and a series of personal crises combined with what he referred to as the war psychosis of his times led Hess to undergo psychoanalysis with J.B. Lang, a student of Carl Jung. One of these years came Damien in 1919. J.B. Lang, student of Carl. Out of these years came a Damien, a novel whose main character is torn between the orderliness of bourgeois existence and the turbulent and enticing world of sensual experience. This dichotomy is prominent in Hess's subsequent novels, including Siddhartha and Steppenwolf, and Narcissus and Goldman, published in 1930. Hess worked on his magnum opus, the Glass Bead Game, published in 1943, for 12 years. This novel was specifically cited when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1946. Hess died at his home in Switzerland in 1962. Calling his life a series of crises and new beginnings, Hess clearly saw his writing as a direct reflection of his personal development and his protagonists as representing stages in his own evolution. In the 1950s, Hess described the dominant theme of his work, from Kamenzind to Steppenwolf and Joseph Necht, protagonists of the Glass Bead Game. They can all be interpreted as a defense, sometimes also as an SOS, the personality, SOS of the personality of the individual self. India is the mother of the world's four major religions. It has given birth to Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. The people of India follow different other religions too, namely Christianity and Islam. The people's belief in their religious ideas are unquestionable. Despite this religious diversification, India is a secular country. It shares the treasure of knowledge and wisdom with the world through its religions. The religions and their ideas are propagated through many literary works by Indians as well as many non-Indian writers. Hermann Hesse is Hermann Hesse is one such novelist and poet, who was inspired by thoughts and ideas of Buddhism. He, in his Siddhartha, in his novel Siddhartha, has eloquently expressed certain religious ideals of Buddhism in a novel way. In his novel, he has emphasized that the true enlightenment is attained through a course of the journey. He has given birth to both spiritual and aesthetic works, Body versus Mind, and seeks personal spiritual attainment outside the constraints of society. So, dear students, this way I have finished my lecture of the day. So, I would meet again next time, and you will be happy. So,